Okay, when we last spoke, we talked about a few ways that cancer cells might be stimulated. It's basically a loss of the control of the cell cycle, and there are different ways that could happen, including mutations in genes leading to the overproduction of protein, leading to extra chemical signals, extra growth factors being made, or a cell might ignore the need for growth factors and continue to divide by mitosis anyway. The last thing I wanted to mention then here in this video series is the role of viruses and how they work. They have been a big part of world headlines, at least at the time of this video recording, and I thought we'd just touch on those briefly. So a virus is an infectious particle, and that means it's not a cell. It's not a living thing, really. It's kind of the edge between biology and chemistry, and they are genes of some kind, or DNA or RNA of some kind, packaged into a piece of protein, and that's about all they are. So your book says they lead a borrowed life, meaning they don't divide on their own. They invade other critters, and then other critters make more viruses. So their typical structure, this does vary, but their typical structures, they have an outer protein shell called a capsid. Okay, and capsids are made of subunits called capsomeres. Okay, so these little protein components stuck together, making this outer covering. And there's lots of different kinds of proteins. So your capsid can vary, your genetic material can vary. So, for example, here we see several kinds of viruses. Some of these have RNA, some of these have DNA inside. Here is an example of a bacteriophage, like we talked about earlier on when we talked about the discovery of DNA as the genetic material. So, lots of different kinds of viruses out there. Um, and some of them even have a membrane, like a cell membrane, around their capsids, and that helps them to infect hosts because their cell membrane can kind of merge with our membrane and help them get into our cells. And those membranes, of course, are made from the host cells that produce them. Um, so it's pretty weird. They kind of steal our parts and they build themselves, and then they put pieces of DNA into our DNA, and then those pieces of DNA can stay there. It's just really strange what viruses do. They are the original genetic engineers. Here's a very simplified viral life cycle to give you an idea how they work. So the virus enters into a cell. So here it is. Here's the capsid. That's its protein coating. And this one, in this example, this one has DNA. It enters into a cell, and once it does so, it will release some of its genetic material into the cell, and that DNA will take advantage. It might merge with our DNA, become part of our DNA, and but in one way or another, our DNA polymerase will make copies of that viral DNA. Um, it will also our cell will eventually make copies of the proteins as well. So the DNA here from the host is used to make messenger RNA. We make it for the virus, and then we make more proteins for the virus too. Then everything assembles into more viruses, and then they escape from the cell and infect other cells. So there's a lot missing in this diagram, but bear in mind we've talked about that this is DNA replication. We replicate the DNA for the host. For the virus. We are the host. So it gets into our cells. We make new DNA copies. We also make new proteins for its capsid, and then everything assembles and it goes on its way. So the virus can't divide on its own. It uses our cellular machinery to reproduce. And that leads us, of course, then to this particular virus, COVID-19. I won't go into everything about it, but it's coronavirus disease 2019 is what COVID-19 stands for. Corona meaning crown because it has these projections all over it that look like a crown. First case was in December of 2019. It moved from bats probably to pangolins to humans. Pangolins are an amazing endangered species. You should check them out. It is an enveloped virus, so it's one of those that has a membrane around it. And it has not DNA, but a positive sense RNA strand in it. That RNA strand can then lead to production of proteins and things like that once it gets into our body, right? here's a diagram of this thing. So notice I'm not going to have you memorize all these parts, but I'd like you to see it has RNA inside. There's the RNA. You should know that. It has a membranous envelope around the very outer surface here, and it has spikes of glycoproteins. We've talked about glycoproteins briefly. Those are proteins with sugars attached. That's what those spikes are that stick off of this thing. Okay, so that's your typical coronavirus. The way these work, kind of like that diagram we saw before, these things will get into our cells. The outer membrane helps it, and the receptors there dock to our cells, allowing them to get in. And I believe the glycoproteins on the outside of COVID docks with receptors found in our lung cells, and so it gets into our lungs very easily. And then we make copies of its genetic material, and its genetic material helps to code for the production of more proteins. Everything assembles, and then kind of like through exocytosis, we make more of these viruses. And they blib on out, and now they're ready to go and invade more cells or be spread from person to person. So viruses are an interesting hybrid between life and chemistry. They're not quite alive, but they kind of act like it in that they get replicated. They don't replicate themselves. They hijack our machinery. And the problem is they often destroy cells in the process of being made. They don't just leave and go on their way. They often fill a cell up with viruses until the cell actually ruptures, releasing viruses, which is one of the reasons they can be so deadly, as well as the various toxins that may be released and other things from their infection. So you can read more about those, of course, all over the media, as well as in your textbook, but I just wanted to introduce you to these basic topics that I think are important to at least have some working knowledge on as you move through your degree in biology or whatever field you may be in. All right, everybody, have a great one.